Welcome to the second episode of Zoroastrianism 101, a series exploring the history, legends, theologies, philosophies, culture, and traditions of one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions and one of the most influential. You don't have to watch our series in order, but if you go back to the previous episodes, you may be able to see terminologies and concepts that are explained there. Sometimes, but not always, we find at the core of many of the world's great religions a central and enigmatic figure. Zoroastrianism is no exception, and at its center, we find one of the world's most important religious personages, Zoroaster, or Zarathustra.
The arguments for a historical Zarathustra go thusly. Zarathustra belonged to an Indo-Iranian oral society that did not concretely record much. Thus, we have to rely on educated guesses. Our best clues come linguistically, such as Zarathustra's name referring to camels and their ownership, which is disputed in etymology. In Zoroastrian studies, there is great debate about whether Zarathustra was a living person or a mythologized character. Most scholars agree that Zarathustra was a historical and living figure and the sole author of the Gathas, ancient poetic compositions core to Zoroastrianism, which hold linguistic support for this argument. For example, Zarathustra refers to himself in the first person, stating the following after being asked who he is. To start off, Zarathustra, I, an honest man, search for all enemies of the Druzhvan. There are many such cases in the Gathas, whose linguistic structures claim to display a coherence that can only be attributed to a single author. When figuring out the time period of Zarathustra's life, we must once again rely on linguistic clues. By comparing Old Avestan, the language of the Gathas, with Vedic Sanskrit, we can use the similarities and connections present to date the Gathas and thus Zarathustra to around the 2nd millennium BCE. One of the leading figures in Zoroastrian studies, Dr. Almut-Hintze, argues that the Old Avestan texts clearly display a Bronze Age society.
Yeah, so my name is Almut-Hintze. I'm the Zartusht Brothers Professor of Zoroastrianism at SOAS in the University of London. My research is mainly concerned with the sacred texts which the Zoroastrians recite in their rituals. These texts linguistically belong to the 2nd millennium BC. We know that because the oldest of these texts still preserve prehistoric sounds which haven't survived in any historical language, Indo-European language, except in the Hittite language, in the Anatolian language. But in the oldest Zoroastrian texts, which are the Gathas of Zarathushtra, there the laryngeals still must have been present when these texts were composed, and that is definitely prehistoric, and we think it must have been perhaps around 1500 BCE. Well, that's, of course, the date of these texts is much disputed, but this would be a date which I would feel comfortable with. The Zoroastrian rituals take us really back, very far back into the past, and not only to the 2nd millennium BC, when we think the oldest surviving texts were composed, which are the Gathas of Zarathushtra and the Yasnahaptanghaiti. But there are also features in these texts and in the rituals, in the setting of the rituals, which have parallels in the genetically related tradition of the Vedic people, out of which Hinduism developed in India. And this is something, so there is overlap both in the religious practice and also in the language itself, which allows us to say that these two traditions, Vedic and Avestan traditions, share a common Indo-Iranian heritage, which as such has not survived, and that takes us further back into the past, into the prehistoric past, the Indo-Iranian or Aryan period, out of which these two traditions emerged.
This, however, conflicts with some curious historical attempts to date Zarathustra. The ancient Greeks and Romans, fond of the figure they called Zoroaster, disagreed on his dating. Roman scholar Pliny the Elder stated that Zoroaster must have lived 6,000 years before the death of the philosopher Plato, or 5,000 years before the Trojan War, and thus around 6,000 BCE, which the Greek historian Plutarch and Hermodorus, a follower of Plato, both agreed with. First-century commentators would claim him as a contemporary of the Babylonian queen Semiramis, filling the role of a Bactrian king around 800 BCE. He was also claimed as the teacher of Pythagoras and was placed in 500 BCE. Historians, like Pliny the Elder, explained this discrepancy as there possibly being two important figures whose lives and teachings were conflated by the ancient Greeks, and possibly even Persian Zoroastrians themselves, thus creating two separate historical Zarathustras, which had little to do with each other. These attempts to date Zarathustra could be informed by Zoroastrian mythological narratives involving cycles where the forces of virtue and corruption would each rule for 3,000 years. Post-Alexandrian Zoroastrians positioned Zarathustra as a contemporary of Cyrus the Great at around 600 to 500 BCE. A notable scholar of Zoroastrianism, Mary Boyce, claimed that due to successors of Alexander the Great attempting to declare an Alexandrian age, the Zoroastrian clergy developed a counter-narrative of a Zoroastrian age. They conflated Cyrus the Great with Zarathustra's first sovereign convert, Kavivishtaspa, and they counted the generations leading back to Cyrus, thus reaching the conclusion that Zarathustra must have lived 258 years before Alexander. This particular date is traditionally given by Zoroastrian sources such as the Bunda Hishin and the Ardavirav Namag around 258 to 300 years before Alexander arrived in Persia. This convention persisted among Zoroastrians for over 1,500 years. It even influenced Western and Islamic scholarship with figures like al-Masudi, the Herodotus of the Arabs, cementing the now traditional narrative for future generations. Furthermore, the Greek sources considered Zarathustra and his closest comrades authors of what is now known as Pseudo-Zoroastriana, a significant body of work of dubiously claimed authorship involving magic, astrology, and prophecies popular in the ancient Mediterranean. Pliny the Elder, Proclus, and Porphyry all reference Zarathustra as unmatched in these esoteric arts. Thus, for thousands of years in the upper Western imagination, Zarathustra has remained a magical and mysterious figure to which anything of great power and knowledge could be attributed. This has caused figures from Pliny the Elder to Voltaire to Friedrich Nietzsche to argue for the historicity of Zarathustra, albeit from a non-Zoroastrian context. Arguments by Zarathustra mythicists cite a lack of material evidence and proclaim that a historical Zarathustra is an invention of Western and Islamic scholars who has no root in material history. Dr. Prodz Okterchervo is a Zarathustra mythicist who states the following: "There is nothing known about him that can be construed as strictly historical evidence by any modern standard of historiography. Wherever Zarathustra is placed in time and space, even as late as in the 7th to 6th centuries BCE, the historical and archaeological evidence from that time and place contains no traces of him." Dr. Chervo also argues that the Gathas reciters were instead mantling a mythological figure by mimicking them through drama and action. James Darmester, a 19th century French scholar and translator, stated that all we know about Zarathustra is mere legend, and Dr. Michael Stausberg noted the following: The Gathas are the closest trace of his existence, be it that he was their poet-composer or that he is portrayed as some kind of heroic or sacrificial figure closely associated with the group that crafted, enchanted, or recited and kept on transmitting them. While virtually all contemporary Zoroastrians endorse the idea that Zarathustra was the author of the Gathas, this notion is a modern and originally Western one. Thus, it becomes vital for us to consider arguments for and against Zarathustra's historicity in order to establish an accurate academic narrative. As a scholar practitioner, I support Zarathustra's historicity, but see the salient points critiquing the lack of material evidence. It may seem comfortable to declare Zarathustra as having no historicity, but still, when studying Zarathustra's life within his religious context, we should consider him as real as Zoroastrians do. With that, perhaps it may aid us further in this quest to make up our own minds on the life of Zarathustra to see what he says about himself in his own Gathas. The Gathas have few details about their composer's life, but we will lay them out here to paint a picture of the man. We know Zarathustra belonged to a clan called Spitama, as he refers to himself as Zarathustra Spitama in a few places. He also calls upon Hektaspa Spitama's blessings. Hektaspa Spitama was either the founder or leader of the clan. Zarathustra composed the Gathas in old age. He lived in a pastoral, politically organized, clan-structured, and profoundly religious society. This society had nomadic elements that included charioteering, herding, fire worship, agriculture, and poetic storytelling. It was also a society beset by rampant violence, brutal raids, and savagery. We know he may have officiated the wedding of Puruchista, his youngest daughter, where an unnamed son is also present. He mentions he's a priest, a Zaotar to be precise, a mantran, which is a reciter of the mantras, as well as a teacher and sacrificer. From this, we can infer that Zarathustra was a member of the pre-Zoroastrian clergy, trained in all the skills befitting his role. He had a spiritual revelation through an immersive and mysterious meditation technique called the Tushna Matai. From that moment, he dedicated himself to Ahura Mazda and its bountiful spirit Spentamanyu. Now enlightened, Zarathustra proselytized Ahura Mazda's teachings, but encountered resistance. He was mistreated by the priests and sovereigns, Karapans and Kavis, of his time. They refused him hospitality and would not engage in dialogue with him. Named enemies emerged, such as Benva, a chieftain Zarathustra pleads for the demise of, and Grema, a rival priest Zarathustra calls a corrupter, with sway amongst the Kavis and Karapans. Zarathustra fears that his lack of success is due to his poverty and begs Ahura Mazda to bless him with cattle, both literally and metaphorically, and treasure, so that he can keep spreading his message. Yet, he was still beset unjustly by tyrants, decrying them consistently. Zarathustra reaches a turning point when he meets Kavi Vishtaspa, his friend and sponsor. Vishtaspa is so beloved by Zarathustra that he is mentioned multiple times in the Gathas with praise and blessings. Zarathustra blesses those who joined his mission, such as the aforementioned Vishtaspa, the descendants of Tura, the Hovga brothers Frashaostra and Jamaspa, and his fellow Spitama clan member Majyomanga. This is Zarathustra's life in his own words, and though there's not much to go on, it nonetheless paints a fascinating portrait of this prophet, his struggles and achievements, his times and his friends. His teachings will be explored in the next episode, so now let's turn to the mythological Zarathustra found in later Zoroastrian narratives. The Gathas are the only scriptures Zoroastrians agree are directly composed by Zarathustra. They comprise the core part of the Avesta, a collection of scriptures composed in the Avestan language. While the Gathas are in the linguistic category of Old Avestan, most of the rest of the Avesta is composed in Young Avestan, a form of the language that dates anywhere from post-Zarathustra to the Sasanian era. So, What does the Avesta say about Zarathustra? At countless points in these later texts, he is elevated to a more sacral status. He is offered worship as a yazata, meaning worthy of worship, and the holiest of humans. The Frauardin Yasht proclaims him the first in many things, including the first virtuous thinker, speaker, actor, priest, warrior, farmer, the first to be enlightened, bring Asha to the world, and turn away from the Devas. It declares him a Ratu, meaning a spiritual master, and an Ahu, meaning a lord, of the material realm, and the most intelligent, glorious, and laudable being. Zarathustra's 3 sons are named here as Isavastra, Urvatanara, and Huareshitra, along with other members of the Spitama clan. He meets with divinities like Haoma, where it is revealed that Zarathustra's father is named Purushaspa, and that he was the 4th person to prepare the sacred Haoma beverage, and thus receive Zarathustra as a blessing. In the Abanyiyayesh, Zarathustra, asked by Ahura Mazda, worships Anahita, the divinity of the waters, directly inquiring as to the best ways to worship her. He asks other divinities like Atar, Tistriya, Dirvaspa, Mithra, Verethragna, Vayu, Chista, and Ashi the same sort of questions. Zarathustra has conversations with Ahura Mazda throughout the Avesta, including the Ors Mazdayasni, where various teachings, mysteries, and formulas are revealed to him. Zarathustra also stresses the necessity of offering worship and sacrifice towards not just Ahura Mazda, but also towards Zarathustra himself. In multiple parts of the Avesta, he is called an Ashavan, a master of Asha. The myth of Zarathustra is found in a grand multitude of texts. Still, no text constructs a truly cohesive yet mythologized narrative of him, as well as a 13th century Middle Persian text called the Zartushname, the Book of Zarathustra. Developed from many sources, written and oral, it weaves together the narrative in such a way that it is the foremost source regarding Zarathustra's life. It reflects the epic poetry of the time, presenting Zarathustra as a superheroic divine figure with parallels to the Jesus tales. It is also heavily influenced by the author's philosophies and theologies, including Islamic influences. The Zartushname says that Zarathustra was a Pishtadian through his father. He was directly descended from Feridun, who had famously defeated Zahak. His mother was Dugdov, a pure maiden who, while pregnant, had prophetic dreams about Zarathustra. The moment he was born, instead of crying, he laughed. This laughter enlightened all around him and shattered the Devas. The dark sorcerers of his time, led by the villain Duran Sarun, hated and feared him, trying to murder him as an infant. They tried to stab Zarathustra in the cradle, but this caused Duran Sarun's hands to wither instead. They then took Zarathustra into the desert and threw him into a bonfire, but this caused him no harm whatsoever, with the fire actually cradling him to sleep. They tried trampling him with oxen and horses and threw Zarathustra into a wolf's den. Instead, the animals protected him. His mother finds and saves him every time, while his father, a skilled magician, consults with the sorcerers who reveal Zarathustra's destiny to him. These dark sorcerers are more like cartoon villains than fearsome warlocks. Barnzinkarus, a Merlin-like sage, raises and protects Zarathustra until he's 7, when the villainous dark sorcerers get up to their nonsense again and curse him. Zarathustra soon becomes sick, and the sorcerers, disguising themselves as physicians there to cure him, attempt to poison him further, but they fail again, which the young Zarathustra simply laughs at. Purushas invites the sorcerers over to a feast, but Zarathustra chides them all at the dinner table for engaging in dark sorcery. He then deftly debates the sorcerers, leaving them afraid and grief-stricken, until he turns 15, 8 years later. Zarathustra spent his youth worshipping the divine, caring for the sick, aiding the needy, and being a traveling mystic whose body was in constant pain. Nevertheless, his heart was in bliss in the spiritual realm. At 30, he traveled to Iran with his followers by walking for a month on a miraculous bridge made of water. Zarathustra arrived with a prophetic vision, calling him to meet with and learn from Ahura Mazda. Zarathustra then entered the waters of the Daiti River and immersed himself up to his neck. He engaged in the mystical Tushnamatai meditation, which caused the Ameshashpenta Vohumana to appear. Closing Zarathustra's eyes, Vohumana took him to the House of Songs, the brilliant abode of Ahura Mazda in Menog. In this spiritual realm, he was celebrated by the Divine Ones. He worshipped Ahura Mazda and asked him many questions. Ahura Mazda answered and taught him astronomy, astrology, the nature of the divinities, esoteric truths and rituals, and the nature of Ahriman, among other things. Ahriman, from his dark pit, tempted Zarathustra with the world's riches and his heart's desires, but failed. Zarathustra then passed the trial of fire, molten metal, and even disembowelment, from which he felt no pain or concern since he was virtuous and pious. Ahura Mazda also gave Zarathustra the Zendavesta, which, strangely enough actually, is not just the scriptures, but also their commentary, meaning he gave Zarathustra a future book. Zarathustra was told to teach it to Kavi Vishtaspa, the clerical Mobeds, and the people. After each Ameshashpenta visited Zarathustra, teaching and blessing him, he returned to the material realm, where all the dark sorcerers and devas gathered a great army to destroy him, and also destroy the Zendavesta. He trounced them all by reciting just one passage from the Zendavesta. This killed some, while others fled in agony. Afterward, he went to Vishtaspa's court in Balkh, found in modern-day Afghanistan, where he deftly dealt with scholars, priests, and princes through debate and miracles, even when they used underhanded tactics like hiding dark sorcerer's implements in his room. This attempt to smear him got him temporarily imprisoned. However, he regained his honor by healing Vishtaspa's favorite horse in front of the whole court, after which Vishtaspa adopted Zarathustra's teachings as his kingdom's official faith. Of course, this is just one narrative of Zarathustra's mythological history. There are further tales in other texts, and even in the oral tradition telling us more about Zarathustra. These tales say he was conceived through a sacred Haoma ritual, that he was slain by a Turanian, that he physically fought the Devas, that he taught powerful theurgical magic, that his essence is stored beneath a Central Asian lake, and, honestly, the stories never end. Zarathustra's life continues to be debated within Zoroastrianism today, with some saying that he's the first great rationalist, and others saying that he's a god manifest on earth, or just a learned teacher. This is a man who has, for about 3,500 or so years, defied all expectations and desires to categorize him properly, transcending all ideas of who Zarathustra actually was. One thing, however, cannot be denied whatsoever. Without Zarathustra, there is no Zoroastrianism, thus making him one of the most important and influential people ever. Thank you for joining us for this second episode of Zoroastrianism 101. We hope it has been informative, entertaining, and insightful in multiple ways. We'll see you next episode when we detail what exactly Zarathustra taught and what the beliefs were of the first Zoroastrian community by diving into the Gathas and the Yasna Haptangaiti, the first liturgy of the Zoroastrian community. See you then.